Episode 59. Let's do this. Welcome to the Hack Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Barnes, providing right now solutions to some of your biggest teaching and learning problems. Now, let's hack learning. When you think New York Times best-selling author, names like Stephen King, Suzanne Collins, and Malcolm Gladwell come to mind. Classroom teacher is not typically synonymous with New York Times bestseller, unless that classroom teacher is Jessica Lahey, author of the runaway hit, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed. And I'm really excited today on the Hack Learning Podcast to talk to my good friend Jess Lahey. We go way back, and I'm so excited to have her here because we often talk about failure without maybe pinpointing it by calling it by the name failure. We talk about how we have to let kids learn by doing, maybe getting it wrong, iterating, and teachers and parents need to understand this. And oftentimes, we struggle with the idea of letting our kids fail. And Jess Lahey, welcome to the Hack Learning Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. And tell us a little bit about what's going on with you and a little bit about why we struggle so much with the idea of failure.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this. What's going on with me? Well, I still teach. A lot of people ask me about that. Are you still in the classroom? And I had to quit teaching full-time when I started writing full-time. The two things just there weren't enough hours in the day, and I was going to shortchange something, and I really didn't want it to be my students. So I'm teaching part-time now, and I teach kids in an inpatient drug and alcohol rehab, which is a very different place from where I was teaching when I taught full-time. The book came about for me because I was seeing my students really becoming afraid of making mistakes, of looking anything other than perfect to me, to their peers, to their parents. And it was inhibiting their ability to try new things, even to write rough drafts, which is such an essential part of the writing process. They were just frozen in their need to look perfect and to have everything be perfect the minute it, flows out of their pen or, goes down on the page. And then I realized, as angry as I was at their parents for setting them up this way to expect perfection all the time, even in the rough drafts, I realized that I was facilitating the same kind of thought process in my own children. I needed a way to back that up and to turn it around, and that's what the book was for me.
Yeah, it's interesting how as teachers, sometimes we tend to expect perfection, but I think we learn over a few years, kids are going to make mistakes, and we have to give them some space. But it's really hard as a parent. And that's one of the things I love about your book, because it reminded me so much of me. My wife and I talked about this often, this idea that we're both educators, and we say, we get that kids have to fail and you have to iterate and say, okay, what did you do wrong here? Let's go back and try it again. But then you have such high expectations of your kids, and it comes across so well in The Gift of Failure that, we have to stop doing this. But the idea is it's not easy to do.
I think there's a bunch of factors that came into this, and it wasn't until I wrote the chapter on the history of American parenting that all of this kind of gelled in my head. But I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, we're having kids older, we're having kids after more education, we're having fewer kids, and for myself anyway, I had my kids after graduate school and undergraduate school and having done some, high-powered jobs and things like that. And I was just so used to these external sort of, here's your assessment. Here's your feedback on how you've been doing in your job for the past 6 months. And I wasn't getting that where my kids were concerned. And so from my perspective, the only way to judge my parenting was by judging my kids. And, that's a big burden to put on very narrow shoulders. And then as parents, we tend to feed that in each other. We stand there on the, sidelines of the soccer field and we talk about what our kids are achieving and how wonderful they are and how great we've done as parents. Of course, we never say that, but that's the implicit message. And that talk, that competitive culture of parenting is highly contagious. And, we seem to whip each other up into into a frenzy. And so it's really hard. We don't want to admit that our kid has failed at something. And I know, when the phone rings and I see that it's the school calling, my stomach sinks every time. I'm thinking, oh my God, it was funny. My sister and I had this conversation. The school called her recently about something. Her daughters are at a new school this year, and her first thought was, oh my God, my child's done something wrong. They're going to think I'm a terrible parent. All these disaster scenarios went around in her head, rather than assuming that maybe the school had just reached out to, make a first good connection, which is what that was.
Yeah, that's a good thing too. And I don't think we do enough of that in school.
No.
But it's great. And we sort of have parents on alert because it's often the bad call, So it is nice to get that good one. And you tell some of these great stories in the book, The Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so their children can succeed. And you share some cool stories about letting go. Can you just give us one of those stories about that, a parent sort of struggles with and they just want to leap to help the kid, and you're suggesting, well, sometimes we have to put the brakes on ourselves. Share one of those with us.
The story that I think really gets at the problem and what can happen when you don't leap is in the book, actually. My younger son, by the way, my younger son has given me either thumbs up or thumbs down on everything I've ever said about him in public. And believe me, there's a lot of thumbs down stuff I'm not allowed to talk about. But this I'm allowed to talk about. He was a 9-year-old at the time, executive function sort of lacking. He's developing, I should say, and had some major organizational issues, was losing things a lot. Kids were starting to tease him about the fact that he lost things a lot. His teachers were just fed up with the fact that homework wasn't making it to school. And I thought, the message I had heard was that he wasn't doing his homework. We came to find out he was doing his homework. He just wasn't ever turning it in. So we tried all these different ways to get him, to get the homework in. And we tried all kinds of stuff that we suggested to him, and that wasn't working. So one day I come downstairs and his homework is sitting on the coffee table, and my first instinct is to take the homework to school for him because I've got to be there in an hour anyway for something else. And after a lot of struggle with this and actually, taking to Facebook and asking friends, what should I do? And explaining that I couldn't take it. A friend of mine who writes a fantastic blog, by the way, called Grown and Flown, about getting your older kids out of the nest. She said, of course you should take it. That's what we do as a family for the people that we love. We have each other's backs. And,
right.
And, if your husband left his phone cord at home, his charging cord at home, you would take it to him at his office. And yeah, I do that all the time. But I realized, something really important for me was the realization that I'm not raising my husband, and I am raising a kid who has issues and needs to come up with his own strategy for this organizational failing. And now is kind of the perfect time for him to work that out for himself. And so when he came home that day, I asked, how'd school go? And he said it was great. And I said, really? Because, you forgot your homework. And he said, yeah, that kind of stunk. I had to stay in from recess with my teacher. And he basically said, this has gone on for long enough. It's time for you to come up with a strategy so you can hang out here and think about a strategy. And that day, he created his first checklist. And it is a checklist that has changed a few times, but is still on the refrigerator. That original checklist was there for like 2.5 years. And that checklist, a strategy I had recommended in the past that he had rejected out of hand. That checklist is what's mostly solved that organizational problem for him. And he still consults his checklist on the refrigerator. This has been 3 years ago. He still consults that every single day because he knows himself well enough, and that's his strategy. So, if I had taken the homework that day, that interaction with an adult, talking about adult, things and how strategies for remembering stuff, that conversation would never have happened. I would have felt really good about my parenting that day. But that whole interaction that really changed his organizational life for school never would have happened. So I'm, needless to say, very glad I didn't take the homework that day.
Yeah, it's ironic. It's a really interesting paradox that I think is so hard for parents. I know it's hard for me because when I read that, hearing you tell the story again, I remember it so well from reading the book. And as I was reading, and in fact, I ran to my wife and I said, look at this. And I said, this is so us, I said, we're so fast to run and take that thing to the child. They call home and say, Dad, I forgot this or that. And now it's really easy for them now because I work from home. So, I need this or that. And it's such a good lesson to say, you can't always jump up and run. And I love how you said, if you do that and someone says, well, that's what we do as parents, you feel like a good parent. I think that's tough for parents because you feel good doing what you think is the right thing when in reality it may be the wrong thing. And look at the lesson, that comes from that with the checklist. And, I love the idea that it's a checklist. As we're talking, I'm thinking about mastery learning and teachers becoming masters and parents becoming maybe master parents. And I wanted to mention a list, the 10 habits of master teachers. And, we want to get better as parents and educators. And what better way to do that than by teaching kids that it's okay to fail? But we have to continue to strive for this. I just wanted to take a moment before we continue talking about failure and how to help people embrace it to remind people about the 10 habits of master teachers. As a Hack Learning listener, if you go over to masterteacherhabits.com today, you can download a list, and Jess has told us how great lists are for kids and adults. And you can download this great list for free. Just enter your email and your name, and boom, you've got it. That is masterteacherhabits.com. Check them out and learn how to be a master today. So Jessica Lahey, author of The Gift of Failure, is joining us, and she has shared a fascinating story about the problem that some parents have, and teachers too, I think, with embracing failure, and that sometimes if we do almost the opposite of what we think we should do as parents or as teachers, it can really benefit kids. So those are great stories. And Jess, we are now in the part of our show in Hack Learning where we try to provide strategies for solving problems right now. Too often in the education world, I think when we read things, a lot of it is about philosophy and research. And again, what I love about The Gift of Failure is it's very much along our lines of thinking. It's that here are some stories and here are some things you can do right now to get better. And I think the problem we're solving is learning to embrace failure to put kids on a path to success. If listeners are saying, boy, that really sounds good, but I just don't know if I can do it. It seems too hard for me to let that child struggle. What would you say? Give us one or two things that you would do to say, I'm going to embrace failure and I'm going to resist the temptation to just give immediately to the kids.
The most important thing you can do right off the bat is to start thinking about long-term goals versus sort of short-term feel-good moments. So yes, I would have felt really, really good in that moment if I had taken that homework. But instead, now 2.5 years later, I am probably proudest in terms of my own parenting of giving my son the opportunity to come up with his own strategy for that problem, because it is still something that is with us as a daily habit. So that thinking long-term goals as opposed to those short-term payoff moments. The other big thing to remember anytime you're sort of trying to decide whether or not you should leap is remember that parenting is not, it's a long haul job, and it's not something that can be measured. The progress can't be measured on a day-to-day basis. The long-term progress with parenting looks more like the stock market, which goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But the hope is eventually it ends up in a higher place than where it started off. And you can have these regression days, and you can have these days where you think, oh my gosh, my kid was further along 6 months ago than he is today. But that's okay, because this is a long haul thing. This is not a moment to moment, checking things off in terms of daily success. So thinking long term rather than short term, I think, is the number one thing that parents can do when they're faced with, one of those moments of, do I protect right in this second, or do I give my kid the opportunity to learn something?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Think long term. And again, it's a hard thing to do. We tend to look, at the daily. And now, in the digital world, I think about education, and the online grade books. And, you and I have discussed this stuff ad nauseum, but, you as the parent now, you get these alerts every day.
Well, some of us get those alerts. I actually have never... My own child, I've never signed up for those. I've never logged on to the portal for my children's school, so I get no alerts.
Yeah, well, I have to get on that path. See, so this is very educational for me, too. I may have to go in and make some adjustments to the alerts because, you're just getting pinged daily with here's what happened today. And, it's almost like we condition parents that you have to see progress every day. But I love what you're saying instead is, let's look at the long term.
And it's not about progress every day. I think one of the most successful things I did as a teacher was I was hearing from a lot of parents that that they had no idea what their kid was studying in class. Their kid wasn't talking to them about that. So once a week, on Fridays, I started sending home sort of a quick rundown of some of the big stuff we learned about that week to facilitate discussion with their kids. That's communication with parents that's helpful. That's, here's what we learned. Maybe play dumb and ask your kid about, when the pyramids happened or something like that. That kind of communication is really helpful. This sort of, I've also had parents say, once a week, I'm going to need a complete rundown of every test score and every score on everything. That's not very helpful and can be extremely detrimental when it comes to your child's motivation to learn for the sake of learning.
We have to be careful to find a balance between, the kinds of alerts or notes or calls from school that are useful and those that maybe sometimes we have to push aside and say, well, I'm going to allow my child to grow over time. Mm-hmm. Jessica Lahey, this has been fantastic, and I so appreciate, as I know listeners do, hearing from someone who is, I always use the term, an in-the-trenches person, not just someone who has, he says, I was a teacher 20 years ago, but, is still doing it, has done it for many years, has taken that wealth of experience that you've gathered over time as a classroom teacher and turned it into something that is so valuable to parents and to teachers. And that's rare, I think, to find a source of any kind. And here's a book that is truly great for parents and educators. It is The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed. It's in every format. I know, didn't the paperback just come out recently?
Paperback just came out, and HarperCollins actually let me narrate my own audiobook, which was so cool. Fantastic because it's in my teacher voice. So that was really fun for me.
Well, you've got a great voice for it. I know it's going to be popular. I know the hardback has been incredibly popular. The paperback's already soaring. This is a game changer for teaching and learning for parents and teachers, and I'm so excited that we've had this opportunity to chat today. Give us a quick exit today. Tell us how we can connect with you, anything you're doing that's new that we might want to know about. Tell our listeners about it.
You can find everything having to do with what I'm up to at jessicalahey.com, but the fun new thing that I've been doing is a podcast called #AmWriting with Jess and KJ. That's with my former New York Times editor, and we talk about writing and pitching and editing and everything having to do with being a writer and the profession of writing.
Well, that's fantastic. I know people are going to want to tune into that. All things Jessica Lahey. Check out her book. Check out the podcast coming from someone who has done it, who is doing it. It just doesn't get any better. Thanks again, Jessica Lahey, for being on the Hack Learning Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
As always, we continue the conversation at #HackLearning on Twitter and on the show notes page at hacklearningpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Hey, the coolest education hackers, listen to the podcast on our free app. Go to hacklearningapp.com today and download yours for free.